Good day. My name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion driven show that examines the intersection between criminal justice and social justice issues. We examine what is happening within the criminal legal reform world, and we ask you, the viewers, to continue to view both sides of the bars and also follow us on Twitter at FOC.org. Today's show is really important in that we are ending 2021 and going into a new year. Examining what has been happening throughout the criminal legal reform world in 2021 is really important. So today we're going to be having a very good discussion with someone who is no stranger to this show, but certainly is really valuable to this show and to the work of the Fortune Society. And I speak of none other than the CEO of the Fortune Society, JoAnne Page, who has been leading the work of the Fortune Society for over 30 years and has been a strong proponent of criminal legal reform and other advocacy efforts to impact the lives of people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. JoAnne, welcome to Both Sides of the Bar. Thank you for joining us today.
It is it is my pleasure. Um, I want to consider the privilege of making this my life work, and I've been at Fortune for 32 years. I've seen an ebb and flow of concern about criminal justice, legal justice, social justice, and I think that this year is a year of high tide and a year of low tide, and we're on an ebb nationally and in New York. Um, it's been a long time. When I first started at Legal Aid as a defense attorney, I never bothered to memorize the drug codes, because there were so few drug cases that came through. And then we witnessed the war on drugs, and we witnessed mass incarceration, and we witnessed a movement against mass incarceration where we've reached significant lows in the number of people who are locked up. And I'm fearful that as we end 2021, we're heading backward at a significant speed. So I welcome a chance to talk about that and to talk about some of the initiatives that have national meaning.
Sure, JoAnne. Thank you for that context. And speaking about national issues, what are some of the national uh, issues you have witnessed throughout this year that's significant and of importance?
The summer of George Floyd was a summer of significant conversation about racial inequity. And I think that it inspired people, and people were in the streets, and we experienced a conversation that has not happened in recent years. I think that was a driver for the Me Too movement of criminal justice, where we were talking about what the human consequence was of policing that demonizes individuals and communities, especially men of color. And we were looking at language both on the corporate side and on the government side of significant reform. But now I think we are talking about the same publicity and fear mongering that we saw that inspired mass incarceration. We are seeing crime and fear of crime showing up in national surveys as the top issue of concern, or among the top, where it wasn't among the top even a year ago. And we are fearful that we are going to see that drive a new wave of mass incarceration. With New York being criticized for bail reform, and a big lie about whether bail reform is responsible for the rise in shootings, in homicides that we're seeing. The evidence is contrary to the rhetoric, but rhetoric rules in our field.
Yeah, and it's important, that you mentioned about bail reform in New York in particular, uh, JoAnne, and like you're saying, like rhetoric is ruling to some degree, and we know, and the data suggests, of the 11,000 people that were released under bail reform law in 2020, only 1% of those had been involved in any kind of act of violence or something like that. And then of that 1%, half of them had either been a witness to something or maybe unfortunately victim of something. But the rhetoric obviously has driven how things or how people are perceiving bail reform. And so when you talk about the national work, Joanne, you mentioned the murder of George Floyd, obviously of Breonna Taylor, what that gave rise to, and people unifying around that kind of stuff. In terms of New York, what are some of the things that you are seeing or have saw in 2021 outside of bail reform, and what has its impact been?
So we had a major triumph, a passage of a law called Less is More, which was meant to restrict technical violations and incarceration on technical violations. And it has been implemented just at the beginnings, but we're already seeing calls to muzzle it and to change it. So uh, we just had a chilling experience in our city council, which is that fair chance for housing legislation that we and John Jay had pushed looked like it was a lock. It looked like it was going to be passed, and it was not even entered to the floor for a vote because of landlords lobbying and landlords fear mongering in media. I'm fearful that this is going to be a wave. This was a legislation about creating a bar to discrimination based on record, where individuals should be looked at based on how they could be tenants, what they qualify for in terms of being good tenants, and not being able to check criminal record and hold people's past against them. Um, it looked like it was going to pass, and then a media blitz by landlord organizations uh, made it pass.
Yeah, and some other things that's happened in New York City too. There's been a lot of conversation around Rikers Island, Joanne, and I know that you've been paying close attention to that, and just some of your reflections and thoughts on Rikers Island, considering obviously it's been lifted up in the media now in so many different ways.
So, Rikers Island, prior to the shrinking of its population, was the second largest penal colony in the world, second only to the LA County jail system. It's a major disgrace to our democracy, and it has been a hellhole for as long as I've been working in this field and for as long as I think it's existed. It's on a land dump and unfit for human habitation. And that's symbolic of how unfit it is to hold human beings. But it's been worse in the past year than anything we've experienced. And more than half of Fortune's staff are formerly incarcerated and came through Rikers Island. It's worse than anything we've seen because roughly a third of the correction officers are out on sick leave, on personal emergencies, on vacation. And what that means is posts are uncovered And in this hellhole, where, as one of our staff said, you're either predator or prey, there's no protection for somebody who is in a post that is uncovered. And there is little protection for people who are abused by correction officers. But now conditions are very much worse than we've ever seen. And because the courts are slowed down because of COVID and because the risks due to COVID are so great, people are in life-threatening situations. And we've seen people die because of the conditions on Rikers Island.
Yeah, Joanne, and I would imagine that some of the conditions that exist on Rikers Island now also exist nationally in other jails, right? Because it's not just restricted to Rikers, the kind of abuse that people experience oftentimes in correctional institutions. But thinking about Joanne, what's happening on Rikers Island, we also know that there has been an increase in the amount of people who are on Rikers Island that have mental health issues. Talk a little bit about that, Joanne, where we're seeing now an increase in the criminalization of mental illness and even substance use.
So when we deinstitutionalized mentally ill people, the promise was that there would be services in the community. Right now, nationwide, correctional facilities are where most mentally ill people get mental health interventions or don't. But there's been a steady climb in the number of mentally ill people at Rikers Island as bail reform has happened, as the population has gone down. We are in another mental health crisis than the people who are incarcerated face, and the two of them amplify each other. The risk of substance abuse, overdose has gone up. The statistics, especially among young people, of suicide and homicide have gone up. And we're in a mental health crisis due to COVID that hits communities of color and poor communities, which also are hit by the criminal legal system, most hard. And we see this nationwide. We see the deaths the deaths in communities of color are astronomically higher. And the strains to mental health are astronomically higher. And when you put people who are also mentally ill in a situation which is a trauma factory, which is what incarceration is, it amplifies it and it can scar people for life. Um, we have seen how at Fortune, incarceration is a trauma factory. And most institutions have wholly inadequate mental health services. They're more about control than treatment. We've heard tales of people who were tranked so severely with psychotropic drugs that they're afraid to take the drugs in the community that they need for their mental health. So, inadequate resources in the community yield people who are mentally ill and punished in a criminal way for illness. It is a catastrophic way to treat people with mental illness, and jails and prisons are not set up to do so decently. In fact, uh, they're not set up to prevent mental illness.
Sure, and this can obviously apply nationally as well, even though we're here in New York City. And staying on Rikers too, Joanne, and then I want to talk a little bit about the borough-based jails and some of your thoughts on that. But one of the things that arose within 2021 is around women on Rikers Island and women, particularly who had Rose and Singer. Just some thoughts on that. And I know there was thinking around moving them upstate to Bedford Hills, etc. What are some of your thoughts on that? women had specific needs, right? And just some reflections on that, JoAnne.
So the first reflection is that we over incarcerate, and many of the women who were moved upstate have no business being in jail in the first place. Second, we got some bad news about the management of Rikers Island when Vinnie Schiraldi was not chosen to head the Department of Corrections. What we are sure of as advocates is that the intent was good, but the results are mixed. What people are subject to when they're in state prison is the rules of state prison, including solitary confinement, including being far from their families. It would have been far better to comb through the people who were transferred to look at who could be supervised safely in the community. There is something terrible about bail, cash bail, and that is that if I have $1,000 in my pocket and I'm charged with the same crime and have the same record as somebody who doesn't, they will be punished brutally by pretrial detention, and I will walk free in order to prepare my case, greatly increase my chance of not having an incarceration sentence, uh, going on with my life, and having a much better outcome. The risk of failure to appear is infinitesimal.
Mhm.
People with bail reform releases uh, show up with the same rapidity that people with bail have. Uh, so there's terrible injustice in this. And I think that with the women, the consequences, because so many of them are the anchors of their family, the multi generational consequences of unnecessary incarceration are huge.
Yeah, absolutely, Joanne. And I know that even members of the LGBTQIA community or folk from the trans community are experiencing challenges on Rikers Island, as I would imagine nationally in other jails as well. But Joanne, talk a little bit about the borough-based jails, right there. It's been discussion around the building of borough-based jails as a result of Rikers Island being permanently closed in 2027. What are your thoughts on the borough-based jails and their importance and significance?
So uh, I would so much like investment in the community to be paramount, but there always are going to be people who get locked up. They shouldn't be subjected to brutal conditions.
Hmm.
And we want to fight mass incarceration. So these jails should be smaller, should be decent places, should be places where resources are available. Fortune has supported the borough based jails because if there isn't an alternative, Rikers will remain. Uh, what President Obama said is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. It's a major change to have enlightened planning and smaller institutions closer to the community while we fight the battle of mass incarceration and when we build smaller so that it's not possible to incarcerate as many people as Rikers has the capacity to incarcerate. You know, when I heard about closing Rikers Island, I thought, what an opportunity to build affordable and low income housing on that island. And what I heard was it's on a dump and there are noxious gases and it's unfit for human habitation. We need jails that are smaller and that incarcerate people who must be incarcerated and that are fit for human habitation and that are engines of rehabilitation. But I don't think that we're going to get there if we transplant the Rikers culture, which is a culture of violence. And what we saw with Raise the Age was that when correction officers were transferred to youth facilities, they brought the culture of violence with them. So there is a culture shift that needs to happen with with a shift in the facilities, and that's a part of leadership. Leadership is imperative to create that. There needs to be a rehabilitative culture. Uh, when Fortune's Stanley Richards was appointed as Deputy Commissioner of Corrections, the first formally incarcerated person, I believe, ever in the nation to be so, even though he had 30 years of service to the community, of being a pillar to the community, of giving back and crime prevention, the correction officers union said essentially the inmates are in charge of the asylum. This is an insult and a risk factor. And with that attitude, uh, the culture would be transplanted.
Yeah. You know, JoAnne, you have been doing this work for so many years and have witnessed so many changes throughout the years in policy and service provision. And obviously, being involved in this work for so long and still being around, you're a hopeful optimist and a visionary. Because were that not so, you wouldn't have an organization that started with 3 or 4 people with you and now with 300 employees. So, if you had your druthers, JoAnne, as a visionary, what would you want to see happen in the new year relative to criminal legal reform issues? Some of those things that you would like to see.
I would like to see a bar against housing discrimination because housing is the foundation for building a new life. And when discrimination happens based on record, it
Mhm.
devastates people. And it is primarily against people of color, so it violates the Fair Housing Act. I would love to see legislation that requires that alternatives to incarceration be the first resort, that alternatives to prosecution be the first resort, because especially with mentally ill people, um, with people who are struggling with mental illness, this is a way of exacerbating whatever risk factors those people and the society face. Alternatives to incarceration, that phrase in and of itself means that the baseline is incarceration. Incarceration should be the last thing that we do to a human being. And when we do it, it ought to be in a way that's about healing and about rehabilitation or habilitation in the first place, not about punishment. Uh, I would like to see the racial reckoning that happened in the face of George Floyd's public murder be what informs our social policy around equity issues and incarceration.
And so, obviously, this show is recorded. And JoAnne is a visionary, as we know. So we know we will be looking forward to seeing these things happen as Fortune continues to do this work and as JoAnne continues to do this work. And all of you as viewers continue to support doing this kind of work around advocacy, around supporting human beings to change their lives. Any closing comments, JoAnne, before we end our show, unfortunately?
Dr. King said that the arc of the universe, the arc of history bends toward justice. We need to grab the end of that arc and bend it sooner so that no lives get lost due to delay. But I think we're in for a year of struggle, and there is a community, a vibrant community of advocates. Fortune prides ourselves in being of that community, but this is a call to action because we are seeing a regression. We are seeing the fear of crime rhetoric that drove mass incarceration rising and driving policy. And this is a time for fighting. This is a time for courage. This is a time for staying solid in the face of major challenge, because we want to bend the arc sooner to avoid mass incarceration.
And how, JoAnne, could people like get in contact with Fortune? Talk a little bit about as you close. Where can people come to Fortune? Some of the things that Fortune is doing now.
So Fortune has a website, fortunesociety.org, and we have both sides of the bars, and we have a national advocacy um, presence. We have a local New York City service presence, but we have model programs that we are really anxious to share. And we have toolkits on our website about some of the issues that we deal with. So I think the answer is start with our website, fortunesociety.org, and that will lead you to our programs and to our advocacy initiatives led by Andre.
Thank you so much, JoAnne, for joining us today. We are out of time, unfortunately, but we certainly will have JoAnne back with some updates. You have been listening to JoAnne Page, the CEO of the Fortune Society, and we've been having a conversation and discussing issues for our year in review. We thank you on behalf of the Fortune Society for listening to and viewing both sides of the bars. We ask you to continue to view both sides of the bars. You can, as JoAnne said, go to fortunesociety.org to learn more about our work. And we ask you to continue to stay on both sides of the bars.